I've spent years working with people, and honestly, some experiences still don't feel real. Back when I was part of a hiring team at a growing tech company, we interviewed a junior developer, early 20s, fresh out of school. He didn't show up alone. His mother walked in right beside him, holding his resume folder like it was a fragile artifact. When I invited him to step into the interview room, she followed without hesitation. I explained, politely but firmly, that interviews are one-on-one. She didn't blink, just smiled and said something along the lines of, "We function as a unit. If you bring him on, you also get my oversight." She then launched into how she would personally monitor his compensation, workplace comfort, and yes, even what kind of snacks we should provide. That interview ended before it started. Security handled the rest. I also lecture at a university, and that opens a whole different door to chaos. One semester, I received a long, furious email from a parent demanding justification for her son's mediocre grade. I replied with the usual explanation about privacy regulations and academic boundaries. The next day, she showed up in person. She'd driven several hours, cornered me during office hours, and exploded. That's when she revealed the real issue. She had written the paper herself. She wasn't defending her son. She was offended that her work didn't earn a higher mark. She admitted everything out loud, as if that would somehow help her case. A relative of mine serves as a training instructor in the military. He once told me about a recruit whose mother contacted command less than a week into basic training. Her complaint? The instructors were being too aggressive with her son, who, according to her, needed encouragement, not discipline. She even asked whether food delivery could be arranged because the standard meals were upsetting his stomach. The recruit didn't last. Apparently, independence wasn't part of his skill set. Earlier in my career, I managed a cinema. We hired a teenage girl to work concessions, and her mother attended every single shift like a parole officer. She hovered at the counter, interfered with customers, corrected orders, and physically stepped behind the register whenever something went wrong. Eventually, we had to let the employee go. Not because she was incompetent, but because her parent was a constant disruption. The response? A threat of legal action for emotional harm. I once dated a man in his late 20s. On what should have been a normal evening, just watching a movie, his front door unlocked. His mother walked in unannounced, carrying laundry. She sat down, folded his clothes on the coffee table, and casually interrogated me about my health background and finances. He didn't react. Not even a pause. I left shortly after and never looked back. One moment that still stands out happened when I was coaching a high school swim team. A student was disqualified for a technical error. It happens. His father lost control, charged onto the pool deck, shoved the official into the water, and tried to force his son back into the race while chaos unfolded. Law enforcement got involved. The swimmer had real potential, but he quit the team the very next day. The embarrassment was too much. Eventually, the situation escalated so badly that authorities had to get involved. The kid himself was actually gifted, real potential, but the humiliation crushed him. He quit the team the very next day and never came back. At another point in my life, I worked in university housing. We had a first-year student move into the dorms, and his mother didn't treat it like a drop-off. She treated it like a relocation. She dragged in an air mattress, set it up right next to his bed, and told his roommate she'd be staying just for a while. Her exact plan was to remain there for the semester until her son learned how to handle laundry. The roommate panicked and called our office immediately. We had to sit a grown woman down and explain that she could not share a tiny dorm room with two teenage boys. She genuinely seemed confused by that rule. A close friend of mine works as a stylist. One day, a guy in his early 20s came in for a haircut, and his mother sat in the chair beside him like a director on set. She controlled every move: how much to take off, how to shape the sides, what to do with the fringe. The guy didn't speak once. When it came time to pay, she handed over her card and said, "This tip is for listening to me, and next time, don't chat with him so much. He loses focus easily." The look on his face said he wished the floor would open up and swallow him. I also spent time working at a summer camp. One camper's mother had secretly sewn tracking devices into his socks and underwear. She called the camp office constantly. "Why has Ethan been in the trees for almost an hour?" His tracker says he's moving fast. Is he running? He has breathing issues. Eventually, we confiscated the clothing altogether. It was unsafe, invasive, and honestly disturbing. I'm also a physician. A man in his mid-20s came in for a routine checkup with his mother. She insisted on staying in the room. Whenever I asked standard questions about lifestyle or sexual health, she answered immediately for him. No, absolutely not. The patient wouldn't even look up. I finally asked her to step out so I could collect a sample. The moment the door shut, he leaned in and whispered that he smoked heavily and suspected he had an STD. That was the first honest sentence he'd spoken all visit. My aunt works in real estate. She once showed a home to a newly married couple, and the husband's mother was present the entire time, on video call. She made them measure every room to see if her furniture would fit, because she planned to stay with them part-time. She disliked the kitchen, so she instructed her son to lowball the offer by tens of thousands. The deal collapsed. The wife looked like she was seconds away from ending the marriage right there in the driveway. Later on, I worked in admissions for a highly competitive university. One applicant arrived for an alumni interview, accompanied by his father, who immediately set up a tripod and camera. He explained that the interview needed to be recorded so they could analyze performance later and pursue legal action if there was any perceived bias. When I told him recording was prohibited, he started quoting constitutional rights. The applicant sat silently, on the verge of tears. Unsurprisingly, that interview didn't lead to an acceptance. The interview ended exactly how you'd expect. The kid sat there, silent, tears rolling down his face. That meeting didn't lead to an acceptance letter, not even close. At one point, I worked as a barista. A woman came in and ordered an absurdly specific latte. Extra steps, custom everything. She took one sip, immediately spat it onto the counter, and started screaming that it was too hot. Then she pulled out her phone and called her son, who had apparently been waiting in the car. A few seconds later, a man who looked close to 30 walked in. She pointed at me and ordered him to yell. He stood there, staring at the floor, mumbling something like, "You messed up my mom's drink, please remake it." It was the saddest example of human ventriloquism I've ever witnessed. Later on, I worked at a bank. A man in his mid-20s came in to open a joint account with his fiancée. Everything seemed normal, until his mother stormed through the doors minutes later, completely out of breath. She slammed her hand on my desk and announced that this account had not been approved by her. She demanded to be added as a third signer so she could oversee spending and make sure the fiancé wasn't using him for money. The most surreal part? The guy turned to his fiancée and actually asked if that sounded reasonable. She stood up, walked out, and I never saw either of them again. I also teach high school. On a museum field trip, one mother insisted on attending as a chaperone. That alone was fine, until she pulled out a leash. An actual child leash. She clipped it to her 16-year-old son's backpack and walked him through the museum like a toddler at the mall. Other students filmed it. Laughed. The kid looked completely gone, like his brain had left his body to escape the moment. At a law firm where I worked, we hired a summer intern named Evan. On his first day, he didn't show up. Instead, his mother called to explain that Evan was exhausted and the commute was overwhelming, and asked if he could work remotely. We said no. Internships are in person by definition. The next day, she arrived instead of him, carrying a notebook. She explained she'd be attending in his place to take notes so he wouldn't fall behind. We had to clarify that jobs cannot be transferred like unused event tickets. I once witnessed something at a university orientation that permanently ruined my appetite. A mother was sitting in the cafeteria with her adult son, fully capable, no disabilities. She cut his food into tiny pieces, blew on each bite, and then physically fed him with a fork. He scrolled on his phone the entire time, completely unbothered. I stood up and threw my meal away. I later worked at a car dealership. A young man bought a sports car outright. His money, earned after selling a startup. 2 days later, his mother showed up alone. She tossed the keys onto the counter and announced that her son was not allowed to own something that fast. She demanded we replace it with a hybrid. The car was already registered in his name. We couldn't undo the sale. She didn't argue, She slashed the tires in the parking lot so he couldn't drive it home. A couple of days after that whole dealership situation, the mother showed up again, alone. She tossed the car keys onto the counter and announced that her son was not permitted to own a vehicle that fast. According to her, it was dangerous, irresponsible, and unacceptable. She demanded we swap it for something slow and sensible. The problem was simple. The car was already legally his. There was nothing we could do. She didn't argue. She walked straight outside and destroyed the tires so he physically couldn't drive it away. My brother works as a wedding photographer, and even he's seen some things. At one ceremony, the groom's mother arrived wearing a full white gown. Not off-white, not cream, but bridal white. During the vows, she stood directly behind her son, gripping his arm. When the officiant asked if he took his partner as his spouse, the mother leaned in and loudly whispered, "Think carefully, Daniel. You can still come home." At the reception, the bride responded by planting a piece of cake directly into the mother's face. Honestly, no one blamed her. I once worked in a pharmacy. A woman called screaming that we had filled her son's prescription with the wrong pills. Apparently, he only tolerates oval-shaped tablets. Round ones were unacceptable. I pulled up the patient's file. He was in his 40s. I explained that he'd need to contact us himself to request any changes. She replied that he couldn't. He was busy gaming. She handled his medical matters. As a hiring manager, I once called a candidate to extend a job offer. His mother answered the phone. She told me he was unavailable because he was asleep, but assured me she could handle the conversation. She immediately began negotiating salary, explaining that her son required a higher offer due to his very refined sneaker collection. When I insisted on speaking directly with the candidate, she hung up. The offer was withdrawn shortly after. I also spent time working as a server at an upscale restaurant. A young couple came in on what was clearly meant to be a date, except the guy's mother was seated directly next to them, facing both of them. She ordered for the table. When the check arrived, she reviewed it carefully and crossed out the automatic gratuity we'd added due to earlier disruptions. Then she leaned toward the girl and said, "My son usually dates women who are more attractive. You should feel fortunate." I had to physically restrain myself from responding. I volunteer as a scout leader. On one overnight trip, a father checked a weather app at 2 in the morning and decided his son might experience light rain. He hiked several miles into the campsite, carrying a massive tarp, and spent an hour loudly installing it over his son's tent. Everyone woke up. The kid was mortified. The father then slept in his car nearby, just in case. At a gym where I worked, a man was training with a personal coach. His mother followed them around the floor holding a towel and a water bottle. After every set, she wiped his face and handed him water, like he was in a championship fight. She also critiqued the trainer, warning that the weights looked unsafe for her son's joints. The son, by the way, was built like a professional bodybuilder. I also rent out apartments. When I leased a unit to a college student, her father called me every single night for the first month. He wanted confirmation that the locks were secure and the smoke detectors were functioning. Eventually, he installed a camera pointed directly at her door and tried to give me access so we could monitor visitors together. That conversation ended immediately. Eventually, that father crossed a line. He installed a security camera pointed directly at his daughter's apartment door and sent me the login so we could monitor visitors together. I shut that down immediately and cut the feed. That was the end of that conversation. I've also worked in IT support. One new hire came to me complaining that he couldn't access basic work systems. After checking his laptop, I realized the issue wasn't technical, it was parental. His mother had installed child monitoring software on his computer before his first day on the job. The software blocked half our internal tools because they weren't on her approved list. I had to wipe the entire machine and start from scratch. He was in his early 20s. At one point, I worked in a bakery. A woman came in to order a birthday cake for her son and brought a physical color swatch to ensure the frosting matched perfectly. Then she handed me a list of ingredients I wasn't allowed to use because her son disliked certain textures. The list included flour and sugar. When I explained that those were essential, she said her son was turning 30 and needed to maintain his figure. Her solution was simply, be creative. I also teach indoor cycling classes. One mother signed up alongside her daughter. During the most intense portion of the workout, the mom kept leaning over and lowering the resistance on her daughter's bike, shouting reminders not to push too hard because sweat is unhealthy. Eventually, the daughter stopped pedaling, stepped off the bike, and walked out. The mother chased her down the hallway, yelling that she'd already paid for the session. I worked at a veterinary clinic as well. A woman brought in a cat for treatment, even though her adult son, late 20s, was the actual owner. She wouldn't allow him to carry the crate. When the vet began explaining the medication and potential side effects, she physically covered her son's ears and said, "Don't tell him that. He'll imagine symptoms." The son stood there playing a mobile game, completely disengaged. The entire interaction felt unreal. Back in college, I served as a resident advisor. During finals week, one student's mother set up a full tent on the campus lawn. She stocked it with snacks, caffeine, and energy drinks, and texted her son every half hour to come down for fuel. She also stopped random students to ask if they had good notes her son could borrow. Campus security eventually asked her to leave after multiple complaints. And finally, driving school. A student was taking his road test when his mother insisted on sitting in the back seat. During parallel parking, she began shouting instructions at full volume. "Turn now, stop, reverse, straighten out." The instructor failed the student immediately for interference. The mother responded by getting out of the car and attacking the instructor with her purse. Like the video, share your thoughts below, and subscribe if you want more stories like these.